Hi, hi, Elizabeth.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hey, listener. Welcome to our podcast today. We're really excited to jump into talking about the value of outlining. I've definitely wrestled with this topic, but Elizabeth is right in the midst of her course right now and has just come off of a meeting about outlining. So she's going to share some of what she's gleaned from that experience of working with writers and directly with that. And then we'll both kind of jump in and back and forth and share about how outlining works for us.
Absolutely. It's the outline was one of those really insufficient areas for me when I started to write my memoir, which is why it's such a heavy focus. It's essentially 2.5 weeks of my 4 week memoir course. Last week was the core message, which, we've had numerous podcast episodes about the significance of that. And so today we launched into the basic outline. So using the 6 elements of plot, like exposition, inciting incident, crisis, climax, those sort of things. And so looking at what each of those are and what from our personal lives would fall into each of those categories. And in doing this process and prepping for this course, I already knew that my kind of catalyst moment or inciting incident was coming too late in the book, that I was spending way too much time in like the setup and establishment of how I lived in my world pre-catalyst, and that going through this course creation, I'm essentially working the course alongside the participants because I'm taking a look at where really was that turning point? Where was that moment where I could not go back to the world before that moment? And there is a key point for me within my story. And as I was helping guide these participants through that process of figuring it out for themselves, it's interesting the level of struggle that we have to identify really where that turning point is. Because sometimes it's a big thing and it's very directly related to the like conflict that's going to then occur throughout like act 2 and ultimately get resolved, in act 3. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's something a little bit more that seems more minor or doesn't seem like a conflict in and of itself, but it fundamentally changes the world that you exist in. It could be something like the pandemic and how the pandemic suddenly changed everyone's world, even though the pandemic is not necessarily the conflict that you're going to overcome throughout the course of the memoir. It fundamentally changed the way that we operate in our world and could be the catalyst of someone's book. So I found that in particular, like of the, 6 elements of plot, that was the one that was particularly difficult for people to grasp. And while it can be something minor, it also has to be, at least in memoir, something that pushes against that core misbelief that you start out the book with, right? So in that ordinary world, you have some sort of misbelief. For me, that was a misbelief that if I showed up fully as myself, I wouldn't be accepted, I would be ostracized. I prioritized connection over, authenticity. And so there were a certain set of like choices that I would typically make because of this misbelief that I have. And that is the misbelief that I then overcome throughout the telling of the memoir. But the catalyst was something that was presented to me, and I made decisions based on my misbelief, right? Still prioritizing connection and community over my own needs and my own best interests. And then I really suffered for it. And then that's what takes you into the act 2, right? So there's that element of it too, that it's not just an incident that changes your external world, but it forces you to come up against that internal belief, that internal conflict, and is what starts that whole journey. So, as far as for the course, the memoir course, I presented the 6 elements of plot, but then I also have presented a couple of different frameworks because those 6 elements can be broken up into a myriad of different, subpoints. I think the hero's journey is particularly helpful in breaking that down a little bit. And then for a more like extreme version, a more fleshed out version would be the save the cat beats that come from screenwriting.
Mhm.
That's what I'm going to get into with my group next week. So this week, I'm just having them come up with what's their ordinary world? What's that beginning point? What does their world look like where they have this misbelief? What's their day to day look like? And then what conflicts occur? That would include both the catalyst, but also those like Dark Night of the Soul moment, that crisis moment that comes later in Act Two. So, what are all those conflicts that they're going to face and deal with and have to make decisions on? And then ultimately, what's that end picture? What is that part that mirrors or bookends that opening original scene? How are they going to show, that they've adopted a new belief and solidly believe it, and how they're showing up differently now than in the beginning? And I gave the example, which comes from, the Save the Cat book, of Legally Blonde, where in the beginning, Elle Woods, her whole mission is to get back her boyfriend, right? And that's why
Mhm.
she decides to go to law school. That's what sends her into Act Two and this whole new world at Harvard Law, right? But then we get to that final scene where he's trying to get back with her, and she's like, no, right? And we know that that's
Mhm.
not the answer she would have given at the beginning of the movie. So we can see that growth because we see a very different choice from her when presented
Mhm.
with a very similar thing. Like we know how she would have chosen in the beginning, and now we see her doing something different. And that's sort of that full circle of the hero's journey of returning back to sort of a beginning point, but coming back changed, grown, different.
Mhm. Well, and that's such I mean, that's such a great example because I'm sure many of our listeners are very familiar with that movie, and also just thinking about, as you talked about, just all of the conflicts along the way that changed and shaped the ultimate decision making. And I think it's interesting when I was listening to you talk about, the challenges that writers face with thinking about, well, what is the point at which things shifted and changed? I wonder if, especially with memoir, if because it's sort of looking at your own life, that sometimes you don't want to think about certain events that maybe are the ones that created change or caused a different shift in your world. Because I know, thinking about, my writing, I'm one step removed. I have my characters and I'm putting them in situations, and I'm coming up with, different things that they're going to be faced with. Although I will say that some are probably going to be reflected, of course, on my own experiences, but there's still that point of being slightly removed. So I can see that resistance coming up for, wanting to make, I mean, there's sort of this natural tendency. We want to make things seem okay. We don't want to think about some of the hard stuff. But I think that, as we've talked before, the huge value with memoir is touching upon the hard stuff, because we are human and we all have hard stuff. And to bring that around and have people feel seen, and I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm such a huge fan of Abby Jimenez's books as a contemporary romance author, and why I look to her as a mentor with my own writing, because she does touch upon tough subjects, and but in
Mm-hmm.
such a thoughtful way. And I think it's true too with memoir. And I think that that's where outlining can really help, because it can keep you focused on where you're going so that you don't
Yeah,
lose
there's
sight
something
of
else
the
I want to
message.
say too, because I see in fiction writing so much of the time the catalyst is something really negative. But with memoir, it's important to remember that it can be something that is inherently positive, like starting a new job, making a move to a new town, right? Or
Mhm.
graduating college. And now you're out in the world as an independent adult. And so your world has fundamentally changed. And then the conflicts may come after that. But the catalyst itself does not have to be a heart attack, a car accident, a job loss, or
Mhm.
a moment of crisis in and of itself. And I think that's where people get hung up, especially with memoir, because so many of the fictional versions that we see of the catalyst, like Elle Woods getting broken up with by her boyfriend when she thinks he's gonna propose. Like they're very, inherently negative on the surface, but
Mhm.
that may not be the catalyst in your memoir.
Well, that's great to clarify because I think that allows for that distinction between the two, and there are a lot of positive things. And it's interesting because I was reading something the other day just in relation to romance writing about, why does every big shift in the book have to be a breakup? Why
Mm-hmm.
does that have to be the way things kind of fall apart for the main characters as they go along? And it made me stop and think about how, that's a really interesting way to reframe some of the potential shifts for the characters, that maybe it doesn't have to be something that's that dramatic, because is
Right.
that really realistic in life? I mean, we if we break up with someone, we're not necessarily inclined to want to go back to that. So
Are we all breaking up with the love of our life at some point in the relationship? I don't think so.
no, I mean, it's not always realistic. So, yeah, but and again, that just goes back to, going back to your outline and thinking about what are, the different stages that your character goes through. And I was thinking about it because I've also reworked some of mine, and one of the things that I did when I sat down, because I reworked the 3-act plot structure and kind of took from different things. And I was thinking about how just sitting down and going with like my first gut reaction to what the prompt was to prompt me to think about the different aspects of the development of my plot was really helpful to not get stuck in trying to figure it out all at once. Because the reality is some of it is going to change, but just being able to get that initial instinctual, like, okay, these are my main characters, this is what they're doing, this is what. And the part where I was kind of stuck was like, well, are they going to break up, or what is that's, I wasn't really sure like how that's going to look, so that's actually blank still right now on my outline, but some of the other things are there.
I think it's so interesting too because I can't tell you how many times I've outlined this one book, right? I did like a cursory outline back when it was still a self help memoir combo, and that was grouped more by like theme and lessons, right? Because it was very self helpy at that point. And then I
Mhm.
had to redo the outline when I transitioned it completely to memoir. And then once I got the divorce, that changed the storyline a good bit, and I added in a bunch more. I did a reverse outline, which I think is really helpful. That's where you look at what you already have, you fill that into an outline, and then look for where the gaps are to fill in those gaps. And then, as I said, I realized that I have just so much, like probably half the book is set up. It takes too long to get to the catalyst. So unfortunately, I'll probably have to cut, a good 20 to 30,000 words. And some of those will still come back in as like flashbacks because some of that information is still important to the reader to understand some of those
Mhm.
prior events. But there's a lot of it that can just needs to go, right? And
Yeah.
so I think I say all of this just to say that an outline is something that you do and revisit over and over and over again throughout your writing process. And as much as you like fully flesh it out in the beginning, you are very likely to revisit it throughout, the writing and editing process. I mean, I think that's just simply good practice. maybe the writers who, have like 70 books out and have a very formulaic way of writing because they hit all the same kind of like points and beats
Mhm.
are more versed in this. And I could see definitely it being easier for fiction than for memoir because of the limitations you have of the only stories you can pull from are the stories you've lived. You can't just like
Yeah.
fabricate like, oh, I need a crisis moment here. The dog dies. And so I say that to say that the guide that you've created is something that anyone at any point in the writing process should take a look at and just see if their stuff is fitting in there correctly, if they've, put something like timing wise, like if it doesn't fall in the right place, because that speaks to reader expectation. That's what I
Mhm.
was really coming up against with having so much setup is essentially you're going to get feedback that, oh, this story is kind of boring. It has no direction. I stopped reading it. I ended up like putting it down. And so those are the sort of feedback we want to avoid by having a really solid outline. And it's not just do you have these moments, but are they occurring at the right pacing in the book? And
Yeah.
so if you're at any point in the process, I think it's important to periodically go back and revisit your outline.
No, I absolutely agree with you because I this is not the first time I've sat down to outline either. I've definitely had several iterations of outlining, and I mean originally I started, and I've shared on previous podcasts, originally I started like, oh, okay, I have this idea, I'm just going to write, I'm going to go kind of the pantser style of writing, but then I realized with my own sort of lack of focus sometimes that it's really helpful to have the outline as a place to keep me in line with where I'm going. And it makes it so much easier to get the writing done, not allow myself to get distracted or have sort of shiny object of like, oh wait, but this idea could work, or this idea could work, or my characters could do this, or but keeping it true to where I started, what my purpose was from the beginning, and having the outline there is that touchstone for, okay, where am I going, am I staying true? And I love what you said about reader expectations, because certainly in the genre that I'm writing in, there are huge reader expectations. I mean, I've read and listened to so many contemporary romance books over the past couple of years, and there are the beats to those books. When things are coming, and for example, I always know that in the last sort of 20 to 30 minutes of the audiobook is when everything's going to get wrapped up. I mean, it's just very predictable. It's like, oh, okay, there's that much time left. Okay, this is where everything's going to be sort of tied up and in some, neat little package. And but there are those predictable points. And I think when you have a very specific type of reader, they are looking for that. And we've talked about this before too, for you with memoir, about, if you're putting a blurb on the back of the book that's talking about how the memoir shares a transformation in some way, and you're like, oh, I'd love to know how that happened. But then if you were to read it and there wasn't really evidence of any transformation, then it's not giving you what you were expecting as the reader.
Right, right. And I think as it, so the week 4 step of the memoir course is really looking at character development and character arc. I think if I hadn't already noticed the issues with the long setup in the outlining portion, I would have found it once I looked at the character arc as far as like what's then motivating this character to make this choice, what problem is this solving. I would see how extraneous some of this background information is, which is why I think either in conjunction with the outline or as another step of the outline, looking at what the internal events are that are happening, because plot and outline, that's all the external, cause, then the character makes a decision and there's an effect, and then that presents a new cause, and then the character makes a decision and then there's an effect. but our decisions on the outside sometimes go towards our goals, or sometimes we're holding ourselves back from our goals for whatever reason. And so looking at the deeper internal character
Mhm.
development too, in conjunction with that, and making sure that the reader understands why the character is making this decision at this point, is also fundamental to that eventually like more full fleshed outline. And a lot of, at least what the referencing that I'm using within the course, comes from Story Genius, and looking into, I mean, even for fiction, I mean, she's writing for fiction, but it does talk about what is that your main character's misbelief about themselves. And you have
Mhm.
two main characters in a contemporary romance. So what are both of their misbeliefs about themselves, and how does that press against one another to become the source of the conflict? So then the
Mhm.
conflict can feel more authentic, because it's not necessarily even something that's externally happening, or maybe it is something that happens externally, but it's pushing against, one of the character's misbeliefs, and then they respond in such a way that then triggers the other person's misbelief, and that's where the conflict really comes up, as opposed to, you know just a breakup, right? You can
Right.
almost find like a more authentic, real feeling example of relationship struggle once you dig deeper into the character motivations and goals.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that that's a great point in terms of thinking about the value of having the outline to make sure that you're keeping the message consistent throughout the book as well, and thinking about staying true to who your characters are, and of course in memoir staying true to who you are, and making sure that comes through as you're writing. And
Mm-hmm.
the outline can of course be as detailed or as sparse as you want it to be, but I think the more points that you can put into it help allow for building that really good tension between whether it's you with yourself, or your character with another character, and really having that thought through in a full, sort of coming full circle. Because I think one of the things that I've noticed, that where some books can fall short, is if they start out one place, but then they don't ever keep circling back to the the points as they go. Because naturally as readers, I mean, we can't remember everything we read. I mean, certainly there probably are people who, remember every single thing they read, but we're reading and we're absorbing the story, and it's always helpful to keep sort of coming back and touching upon those common points throughout. And the outline can allow you to look and say, okay, I touched upon this here. I need to keep circling back in each of the acts so that the reader is still with you, but also it's realistic in terms of how we work as people, is that we
Mm-hmm.
circle back to feelings and experiences. And our life is not linear. An event doesn't just happen and then all of a sudden we're moving on to the next thing and we've forgotten about that. It allows for that consistency in your writing. And it's just a great tool, I think, to have. And I know some people are very resistant to it, and maybe listener, you're someone who is able to sit down and be a pantser and everything just happens for you. But I know I've certainly learned for myself that with shifting to fiction writing, that it's just as valuable for me as a fiction writer as it was for nonfiction. I know for my nonfiction writing, I mean, having my outline where I had my headings and my subheadings figured out before I even started was so helpful to keep me focused on what are the important points that I want to touch upon. And I've even thought about that, even though I have, the 3-act structure, but even within that, each of those can be, the status quo. Okay, what's the ordinary life? Well, what are the pieces underneath that? What are the
Mhm.
subheadings to that part of the book? And then going on to, okay, well, what happens that kind of triggers a shift, and then and so on. And so I think that it's been really helpful for me to make sure to outline.
Yeah, through the numerous workshops that I've attended recently and hearing writers, published authors talk about their processes, it does seem like there's a trend where the plotters spend more time in the upfront with the outlining and the pantsers spend more time in the editing. So either way, you're going to put in the work somewhere, and then it all boils down to personal preference, whether you prefer to just get the words out on paper and you prefer to let your characters sort of dictate the direction, and then you make it, you edit it to fit those beats and those points. For memoir, I just think it's just not an option because you're so limited in what your character can do anyways, because you're defined by what actually occurred in your life, that I don't really see any reason to pants that genre of writing. You're just making so much more work for yourself in the editing process, where a lot of those stories can't really be reworked. They just have to be cut. And that is a waste of potentially your time and energy that could be better spent just on the front end doing the outline.
Well, and that's why you're providing so much value for those who are participating in your course, is giving them this structure from the beginning so that then it saves time in the long term for, and the book will get done faster because of having the organization, as opposed to sort of trying to guess at how to accomplish the writing.
Sure. And
Listener, I know.
how do you foresee people using the three plot act structure and guide that you have available?
Well, I see it much in the same way that you've talked about resources that you've shared, that it's a great point of reference for helping you get your writing organized. And like I said, I printed it out and I just went through it sort of right from the gut reaction of, okay, who are my characters? What's their ordinary world? And going on to the complication. And then, what's the piece that causes the next shift for the character, and then the going into the conflicts, and so forth. And I think it's a helpful reminder of thinking about sort of the pacing for the book, sort of the 3-act structure, especially with romance writing, is around, like, maybe 10 to 12 chapters for the first act, and sort of adding to that as you go into the second, another 10 to 12 chapters, and so forth. So it kind of helps to think about, how to move through the novel. And again, I think it's just another tool for your toolbox as a writer to have a strategy that is helpful for planning. And I mean, with anything, you can use it as much as you want to use it, or tweak it to shift to fit your style a little bit better. But, it outlines the structure for you, provides a prompt for things that you can think about for that part of the book, and, space for you to jot that down. And the 3-act structure naturally mimics our way of storytelling. There's the beginning, act 1, the middle, act 2, the end, act 3. It naturally ties into that flow of how we tell stories.
Yeah, I gave an example today when in just presenting the like three acts and the six elements of plot. I found sort of an outline of the Three Little Pigs, right? Which is a story we're all very familiar with. The three little pigs set off and they go to build each of their houses. That's the exposition, or beginning of Act One, and then the wolf comes and shows up. That's the start of the conflict. That's that catalyst.
Mhm.
That is what takes
Mhm.
you into Act Two, right? And
Yep.
then the wolf attacks, the first two houses and then makes an attempt on the third house. And then your climax point at the end of Act 2 that takes you into Act 3 is when he's getting ready to come down the chimney in the third house, the
Mhm.
house made of bricks. And then ultimately he gets boiled in the pot and runs away into the woods, and the pigs live happily ever after, right? And it's I think it's helpful to see such a simplistic story kind of imprinted onto that process so you can more easily grasp just the overall concept. And I think the prompts that you've included within your 3-act plot plan are going to really help people tap into what those portions and those beats really mean and help elicit that inspiration and imagination. So you can
And
find, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that you can find this resource on our website and join our newsletter, and you'll get all of our resources and information that we're sharing that and become a part of our community. And we'd love to have you with us each week in the same way that you're here with us listening. We'd love to jump into your inbox every Monday as well to provide you with these resources that we're developing for our community and just to know what's upcoming. And I know that we have some upcoming guest podcasts that are going to be very exciting.
Yeah, listener, we have a series of guest podcasts that we're going to be recording within the next few weeks. So please subscribe to our channel. Please follow this podcast so you don't miss those. We're going to have someone who's going to present the 5 steps to your elevator pitch for pitching your book, whether that's to an agent or whether that's simply when you have to go do the marketing of the book yourself, which we all have to do as published authors, no matter what route of publication we take. We are going to be speaking to a published children's author about her process and what she learned about the industry, how she crafted her story. And then we are also going to be speaking to an author of a memoir who is currently pitching her book to agents and is navigating some of that trickiness of the traditional publishing route. And so, if any of that sounds at all interesting to you, these are going to be really great conversations that we have in the next couple of weeks. So, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss those. Subscribe to the newsletter. Whatever way is going to help you stay connected so that you get to hear these really interesting conversations. And I know there's going to be so much value in them. So thanks for listening this week, and we can't wait to have you tune in our subsequent weeks.